Well, welcome. I'm Yael Aronoff, the director of the Sterling Institute for Jewish Studies in Modern Israel, and we're here for a really exciting event that we're all really enthusiastic about, which is our professor, core faculty member in the Sterling Institute, in the Department of Religious Studies and Jewish Studies professor, also with lots of affiliations, including the Department of History and Center for Gender in a Global Context, and I think I'm missing one in Center for Interdisciplinarity. But we're really excited about this fantastic book coming out that just was published maybe 3 months ago and already has some good reviews circulating, and already Dr. Yares is being, I think she just came back from UCLA, was it? Or
Stanford.
Stanford? Mm-hmm. I think somewhere in California, sorry, that she's going to be in real demand to talk about her book. She's a multidisciplinary scholar, so she's looking at religious studies, history, ethnography, and education. And she is informed by feminist methods, and her work uncovers the voices of participants that have been marginalized in the telling of Jewish history, which include children, women, and those without formal Jewish schooling, and brings them into the foreground of scholarship on American Jewish lives. She's also has a forthcoming book that she's been really working hard on with a colleague, Sharon Avni.
Mm-hmm.
And already, both in terms of the current book she's going to be that just came out, that she's going to be talking about, and this developing book called Artful Education, she already has lots of fantastic articles in prestigious journals, varied journals, and book chapters. But this forthcoming book is also really exciting and looking at how Jewish identity is expressed in different ways in theaters and museums, in TV shows like Stitchel, and she has incredibly innovative ways of talking about it and looking at it. She's also a fantastic teacher, as we all know. I see how many students here. And those of you who have heard Dr. Yares before, she's very engaging, funny. So the content is super interesting, and the delivery is really engaging. So we're in for a treat tonight. I just want to quickly thank our co-sponsors, which include the College of Arts and Letters, James Madison College, the College of Social Science, the Office of Institutional Diversity and Inclusion, International Studies and Programs, the Religious Studies Department, the History Department, and the Center for Gender and Global Context. So I think, hopefully, I have it all. So as I said, we're in for a treat, and we're really, really excited about your new book. So
thank you. Well, thank you, Yael. That is there's very enthusiastic billing for a book on 19th century history. So I'll try and live up to those lovely warm words. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, students. Thank you, colleagues in both religious studies and Jewish studies. You know, at the midst of just an incredibly hard time, I'm more appreciative than ever of you taking the time to come and let me talk to you about my recently published book today. It's actually kind of a delight to retreat back into the 19th century when the concerns of American Jews looked and felt very, very different. So I'm happy to do that today. So this book is about 19th century American Jewish education. But over the course of researching and writing it, it took me about 10 years to research and write. I did find myself talking quite a lot to people about their supplemental Jewish education. And what I found was that if you engage a group of adult Jews in talking about Hebrew school, what you will get is a litany of complaints about forced attendance, and long lessons, and how much they yearn to really be at Sunday morning soccer practice. I think too, if you look at depictions of Hebrew school or Jewish Sunday schools in popular culture, right, it's kind of depicted as a rite of passage that American Jews love to hate. So I'm thinking of films like the Coen brothers film A Serious Man, or the short stories of Philip Roth. It's to the extent, I think, that cynical descriptions of Hebrew school are almost an American tradition unto themselves. So one parent who participated in an ethnographic study History of American Jewish Education once said, "My son Eddie has told me that he hates Hebrew school." And I say, "Edward, that's wonderful. You're carrying on a Jewish tradition. Because when I went to Hebrew school, I hated it too." You knew what the punchline of that joke was going to be. So going to Sunday morning, giving up Sunday morning soccer to go to religious school at the local synagogue, I think if some of these depictions are to be believed, it might seem like an age-old tradition for Jewish education. But in fact, in the long sweep of Jewish history, it began relatively recently. The invention of the Jewish Sunday school was part of a broader set of attempts during the 19th century to reimagine religious learning as an activity that could be separated from secular schooling. And more specifically, it was an attempt to reimagine Jewish education as religious education that was premised primarily on learning a set of faith commitments rather than the much broader set of skills and knowledge that has often been taught in Jewish educational institutions. So in my talk today, I'm going to tell you more about how those two intersecting projects created the foundations for American Jewish education and for the Hebrew schools that so many Jews today say that they love to hate. So let's start with the first project, and that's the project of separating religious learning from secular schooling. And to put this into context, it's quite helpful to have the broader historical chronology of the emergence of public schools in the US in mind. So universal tax-supported public schools began to emerge in the northeastern states during the 1830s and 1840s. And the availability of these public educational options had a profound impact on Christian educational providers. And that's because Christian Sunday schools had previously offered classes both in general literacy and also faith-based education to children who couldn't otherwise afford to attend school during the week. With the emergence, though, of the free public schools, these Christian Sunday schools began to adopt a more explicitly religious curriculum. So they differentiated Christian religious instruction from general studies, and they reimagined their role as providers of explicitly religious learning, and often it was in an evangelical key. So the birth of explicitly religious Christian Sunday schools emerged in the last decades of the Second Great Awakening, which was an evangelical revival movement that sought, among other things, to build a public American Protestantism. And one historian, Anne Boylan, has noted in a history of the Christian Sunday schools that Christian Sunday school teachers often would conduct what she calls street sweeps on a Sunday morning. That was going out into the streets and finding any children who were playing there and bringing them in to these Christian Sunday schools. And of course, you know, for children in the 19th century, there really wasn't anywhere else to go. So that made children very, very vulnerable. Now, evangelization efforts towards children, it seems, weren't restricted to Sunday mornings, because similar efforts seem to have been periodically at large in the public schools as well. Nominally, of course, these schools were non-sectarian, but in reality, when we look at Jewish sources, we see that teachers often took the opportunity to evangelize Jewish youth who came into their classrooms. And even absent of explicit evangelization, Christian scriptures and teachings were often utilized as curriculum material. So this here is Isaac Leeser. Isaac Leeser is a major figure in 19th century American Jewish history. He was the chazan, the spiritual leader of a major synagogue, Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia, which was a traditional Sephardi synagogue. And he founded one of the first American Jewish newspapers. It was called the Occident and American Jewish Advocate. And in his capacity as editor, he wrote quite regularly in his newspaper about the dangers of allowing Jewish children to attend public schools. He said, you know, if you send your children to public schools, they're going to be subject to prayers, to readings, and to books with explicitly Christian themes. They might have been, on paper, non-sectarian, but essentially they were Protestant. So in 1843, for example, he warned his readers, quote, "We are in great error if we suppose that Christian teachers do not endeavor to influence actively the sentiments of their Jewish pupils. There are some, at least, who take especial pains to warp the mind and implant the peculiar tenets of Christianity clandestinely." So this was the context that underlay the founding of the first American Jewish Sunday school in Philadelphia in 1838. And it was a community school. It was independent rather than being connected to any one particular congregation. The person ringing the opening bell was a woman by the name of Rebecca Gratz. She was American-born. She was from a wealthy Sephardic family. She belonged to Mikveh Israel, which Isaac Lisa served as Chazan. And she had dedicated her life to philanthropic work among Philadelphia's needy. She called her school the Hebrew Sunday School for the Instruction of Israelites, and it offered its pupils a safe space to spend their Sunday mornings and a couple of hours of basic lessons in Judaism that she hoped would equip these Jewish children with sufficient Jewish knowledge to rebut the claims of these predatory missionaries. Now, Gratz's school explicitly drew from contemporary Christian models, and it was really no coincidence that Philadelphia, where she lived, was also home to the national headquarters of the Christian Sunday School movement. So like these newly imagined Christian Sunday schools, Gratz offered a Jewish education that was divorced from general studies. And also like the Christian Sunday schools, the curriculum of the Philadelphia Hebrew Sunday School offered what Gratz understood to be a religious Jewish education. And that was a very specific interpretation of religion. Now, Gratz's curriculum was very, very different to what was offered by other contemporary American Jewish schools at the time. So in 1838, when she founded the first Hebrew Sunday School, Jewish parents could choose to send their children to all-day Jewish schools. Those were schools that taught both general and Jewish studies. Or they could send their children to Talmud Torahs. They were afternoon schools. They met every afternoon during the week, specifically for Jewish learning, and usually they were limited to boys. Now, these schools taught their male students a range of Jewish subjects that included Hebrew, aspects of the Jewish legal tradition, and how to read the Chumash, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, usually with the commentary of Rashi, who is a 12th century French rabbi. Now, Gratz eschewed this curriculum. In its place, what she offered in her school were English language prayers and English language Bible readings. She offered lessons that illustrated the importance of good morals and faith in God, and a couple of simple home rituals for celebrating the Jewish calendar. And unlike most of the more traditional schools, her school was open to girls as well as to boys. Now, this curriculum was quite honestly a pragmatic choice, right? You couldn't teach the Chumash, the Bible, and the commentary of Rashi, or the intense legal disputations of the Talmud in a school that only met for a couple of hours per week. And to be honest, neither Gratz nor the other women who joined her to volunteer as teachers, well, they hadn't received an education in those subjects either, because they hadn't attended these intensive Jewish schools because they were female. So quite simply, what they taught was what they knew. They taught concise lessons that were really steeped in the values of 19th century bourgeois female religiosity. Right? They taught piety, they taught benevolence, they taught virtuous conduct. Now, Gratz's initiative was a really timely intervention, and she created it in response to some very, very pressing social needs. So the year is 1838. And this was a time of immense immigration of Jews to the US. Only about 2,000 to 3,000 Jews, who are mostly of Sephardi origin, settled in the US in America before 1830. But between about 1820 to 1880, we see about 150 to 200,000 Ashkenazi, that is European origin, Jewish immigrants coming to the United States. They were mostly from Western and Central Europe, and they spoke German. Now, for these new immigrants, joining congregations and enrolling their children in expensive all-day or every afternoon schools, well, that was really, really challenging because, of course, as new immigrants, they had really scarce financial resources. And their children were often having to be involved in the family economy. And that meant that either they were going out to work, or they were doing piecemeal work at home, or they were taking care of younger siblings so that their parents could go out to work and provide for their families. So these children had very, very few opportunities to attend day schools or afternoon schools that were held every afternoon during the week. So while Rebecca Gratz's Hebrew Sunday School was by no means the first Jewish educational institution in America, it was the first that sought to be universally accessible, right? Irrespective of a child's gender, irrespective of the financial capacity of the family, whether they were a member of a synagogue or not. So what I want to really emphasize here is that Gratz's idea of a school that met only for a few hours on a Sunday morning and that taught only a very limited range of subjects, this was really a pragmatic choice rather than an ideological one. Right? Gratz wasn't a proponent of the Jewish reform movement. She was Orthodox, she was traditional, she belonged to Mikveh Israel. And she wasn't an advocate for the dismantling of traditional Jewish scholarship either. Her goal really was not a revolution in Jewish learning, but rather to create an institution that would be accessible, right, to the children of these new arrivals. Now, the fact that Rebecca Gratz had really kind of put her finger on something and created an institution that was very, very practical and very, very appealing, I think is evident by the fact that within the year, we see 2 more Sunday schools being created in other cities, also by women. So the first was created in Charleston, South Carolina. It was created by a woman called Sally Lopez, and she belonged to a Reform congregation in Charleston called Beth Elohim. And Lopez wanted so exactly to recreate what Rebecca Gratz had done in Philadelphia that she had Rebecca Gratz write out her lessons and send them to her by mail each week so that she could replicate them. A couple of months later, another Sunday school was created in New York. It was created by the women of Shereth Israel, which was a traditional Spanish-Portuguese synagogue. And like Rebecca Gratz's school in Philadelphia, it offered classes for poor Jewish children every Sunday, irrespective of whether their parents were members of the synagogue. And then a few months later, in 1839, another school was founded in Richmond, Virginia. It was founded by the Ladies' Auxiliary of Beth Shalom, which was another Orthodox synagogue, and it was, again, founded by a local Jewish woman. Her name was Emma Mordechai. What you may have noticed here is that the first Jewish Sunday schools were, of course, all founded by women. And they were also created by communities that spanned the denominational spectrum of 19th century American Judaism. Right? They were created by, under the auspices of congregations that today we would describe as Orthodox or traditional, as well as by synagogues that identified with the Reform movement. And I think that's really important to note because many Jews today might think of Sunday school as a Jewish educational option that is primarily associated with liberal Jewish denominations. But in the 19th century, they were founded by Orthodox communities and not only by Reform ones. And they were founded by communities across the denominational spectrum, really because they were pragmatic. They were pragmatic and they were affordable for an American Jewish community that was largely comprised of financially insecure and mobile new immigrants. So they seem to offer a realistic model for religious education, irrespective of what your particular ideology about Judaism and Jewishness might be. And I think to understand this, right, to understand how this would be appealing to people, whether they were, Orthodox, traditional, or Reform, it's important to understand that America offered really unprecedented latitude to its Jewish community. And as a result, few American Jews seem to think it too much of a priority to be a member of a Jewish institution. So, of course, there was congregational autonomy, and there were not recognized sources of communal authority as there was in Europe. So Sunday schools were a really expedient solution to the problem of trying to make Jewish education accessible to American Jews who, for the most part, didn't see themselves as tied to institutions. So it wasn't long before the opening of the first American Jewish Sunday school that the more intensive all-day and afternoon schools began to shutter. And Sunday schools became the dominant model for Jewish education in America, and it would retain that status until the early years of the 20th century. Now, from the outset, Jewish Sunday schools described Jewish education in explicitly theological religious terms. So Jewish children were instructed in these very precise and concise lessons that illuminated the religious truths of their tradition. And they were taught that way primarily to equip them with a narrative for countering Christian truth claims. So it was an attempt to engage Jewish children in understanding their own tradition in the terms of the reimagined Protestant Sunday school as a religion that could be learned on a Sunday morning, separate from the business of general literacy. Now, I think it's important to state at the outset that for Jews to imagine Judaism in these terms, as a set of beliefs for private consumption rather than as an all-embracing way of life, well, this certainly required the erasure of much that has historically been central to Judaism and Jewishness. So we might look to the words of an American Jewish theologian, Mordecai Kaplan, who would later go on to found the Reconstructionist movement in Judaism. And he said that Judaism more accurately resembles a civilization than a religion. And as a consequence, learning Judaism has historically been a matter of learning languages like Hebrew and Aramaic, the language of the Talmud, learning methods of legal reasoning, foodways, cultural habits, calendar, folklore, creedal formulations, principles of faith. Historically, they've played a relatively minor role in Jewish education. So to define Judaism in these terms, as a religion, primarily focused on Judaism as a belief system, well, that required a pretty fundamental overhaul, a curricular overhaul of the business of Jewish education. So when I began my research on the history of Jewish Sunday schools in 19th century America, what I was really interested in doing was tracing the implications of defining Judaism in the Protestant terms of religion for the purposes of Jewish education. And I wanted to know, how did this change the ways that Judaism was taught and learned? How did defining Judaism as a religion shape the ways that they described the relationship of Jews to other religious groups? And perhaps above all, how was the attempt to define Judaism in religious terms shaped by contemporary ideas about what religion was and how it could be defined? Because if you've been trained in the field of religious studies, which I know that some of my colleagues here today can certainly attest to, at some point you'll take a theories and methods course in which you learn that the field of religious studies was born in the 19th century. And it was born out of attempts to define what religion was by scholars who were situated across multiple scholarly fields. Now, these studies in so-called comparative religions broadly proceeded from the presupposition that religion was a transcultural and universal phenomenon. So they promoted the idea that behind all of the many world religions, there was a single genus, religion. And the origins of that genus could be mapped across time and across cultures, and even that the development of the genus could be made to fit evolutionary patterns that spanned throughout history. So these authors proposed that religion had an essential identity, and they sought to trace the variant ways that this essence was animated in different cultural contexts. But most of these scholars were not neutral on the question of what good religion really looked like. They arranged the so-called world religions into progressive hierarchies that almost always describe Protestant Christianity as the most advanced incarnation of the religious genus. Now, what immediately became very apparent to me as I began this project was that American Jews, maybe counterintuitively, seem to have been really interested in this branch of scholarship. So, in this comparative religious studies genre, and they used popular texts that were published in Europe and in America, even those with explicitly Christian overtones. Now, to put this in context, I think it's helpful to understand that comparative religious studies for much of the 19th century was a largely European enterprise, and so too, Jews in America were also coming from European origins. They were predominantly German-speaking. And so the Atlantic was a permeable boundary. 19th century American rabbis often arrived in the US having studied, often to doctoral level, at universities in Europe. And when they were born or arrived here in the US as young children, they would often return to Europe for postgraduate studies or to earn their rabbinic credentials. So ties to the European intellectual scene remained really strong. American Jews, they read books published in Europe, they contributed to European journals and periodicals, they corresponded with European rabbis and intellectuals, and they kept abreast of European scholarly developments. Now, American Jews were really interested in this new field of comparative religious studies because they interpreted it as serving some very particular Jewish needs. This was a time of rapid assimilation among American Jews. And it was also a time when some secularist movements like free thought and Darwinism were in their ascendance and seemed to be attracting people away from traditional religion. In contrast to these dynamics, these studies in comparative religion seem to suggest to their American Jewish readers that in fact religion was universal and religion mattered, because you can see it in every aspect of humanity. And if religion mattered, then consequently Judaism should matter too, right, in the lives of American Jews. So this is Max Lilienthal. He was a rabbi in Cincinnati. And in 1872, he delivered a sermon in which he talked about the benefits of comparative religious studies and told the people listening to his sermon that they should take it seriously for the following reason. He said, "The men of this new science teach us irrefutably that the human heart was always and in all possible forms longing and yearning for the infinite Father and Creator." A couple of years later, in 1888, another rabbi in Chicago, his name was Isaac Moses, he said in a letter to the American Israelite newspaper that now everyone is interested among American Jews in the question of where religion comes from. So 19th century Jewish religious education was imagined and created amidst this enthusiasm for understanding the origins of religion and for exploring the different ways that religion could be defined and conceptualized and explained. So American Jewish religious education was incubated in a cultural context in which there was a growing sense of confidence that real religion was born from a single genus. So I came to this project on American Jewish Sunday schools really mindful of this ideology around defining religion that was operative during the 19th century. And I wondered, when American Jews were defining Jewish education as religious education, what definitions of religion were they employing? How did these definitions change? And most critically, what kind of rhetorical and cultural work did these different definitions of religion seek to do? In previous histories of American Jewish education, the period of the 19th century heyday of Jewish Sunday schools has mostly been dismissed, with maybe one or two lines of critique that say, you know what, these schools, they did nothing positive, they just didn't mold of religion. And scholars have mostly assumed that because these schools were founded by women, because most of the teachers in the classrooms were women, the religious curricula that they offered obviously offered nothing more than saccharine female spirituality. Now, these critiques have broadly assumed that as the Sunday schools spread beyond Philadelphia, beyond Rebecca Gratz's school, there was little to no development on the curriculum that she instituted. In my research, I found that that was far from true. Sunday schools across the country imagined and reimagined their curricula in many ways over the course of the 19th century. And what is more, as most Jewish Sunday schools were founded under the auspices of synagogues, of congregations, ultimately their curriculum was set not by the women who taught in the classrooms, but by men, by rabbis and male education boards. And very rarely did these males share Rebecca Gratz's particularly feminine brand of domestic spirituality. So there was much more to the religious curricula of these Sunday schools than historians had previously assumed. I began my research for this book in the Library of Congress, and I quickly discovered that one of the most ubiquitously preserved materials from 19th century American Jewish Sunday schools were, wait for it, catechisms. Now, if you're familiar with catechisms, you probably think of them as Christian texts, right? Specifically Catholic texts. But in fact, Jews in both America and Europe wrote catechisms in enormous numbers during the 19th century. And catechisms were the most popular textbooks used in 19th century American Jewish Sunday schools. And they were often taught to students who were preparing for confirmation, which was a coming of age or graduation ritual. And they were taught by the rabbis of the congregation. Now, catechisms were succinct sort of primers, right, of Jewish doctrine and religious thought, and they were usually written in the form of question and answer. Students were expected to memorize these texts, with the idea being that if they did so, if they memorized all the questions and answers in their catechisms, they would have a comprehensive set of basic Jewish knowledge. Now, so catechisms were really aids to memorization, right? As writing down these questions and answers that students were expected to just sort of inhale and be able to regurgitate. They represented, honestly, a contemporary educational technology that was really widespread in American education during the 19th century. So in public schools, in 19th century public schools, primers, right, were very, very popular. And they really testify to a really pervasive belief in the power of memorization for pedagogy that persisted really into the 20th century. And of course, church schools as well, both Protestant and Catholic. They also used memorization of catechisms to teach the distinctive theologies of their various denominational movements. Now, what particularly piqued my interest in Jewish catechisms was that the question that most of these texts opened with, the first question, was the question, what is religion? So these catechisms made the project of defining religion into the first subject, the first lesson that a Jewish Sunday school student was expected to learn. Now, Jewish authors of catechisms who open their texts with the question, what is religion? They seem to me to be implicitly presupposing that Judaism was part of a broader phenomenon that could be called religion, right? So consciously or unconsciously, these authors were rejecting any claim to Jewish existential uniqueness and acknowledging that Judaism was one of many religious traditions. So when they answered this question in their catechisms, when they answered the question, what is religion? They would define how the idea of religion could be understood in a Jewish context, and they would explain where other religions stood in relation to Judaism. So most Jewish Sunday school catechisms began by defining the idea of religion in general, and then question 2 would be defining the Jewish or Mosaic religion in particular, right, and explaining how it stood in relation to the universal genus. Now, what was really fascinating to me as a religious studies scholar about these Jewish catechisms was that most of these authors incorporated scholarship from the emerging field of comparative religious studies when they answered this question, what is religion, in their catechisms. But not verbatim. When they utilized this scholarship, they inverted the hierarchies that were devised by these Christian theorists, and they placed Judaism at the apex of the history of religious civilizations. In other words, what these authors did was not just imagine Judaism as a species of the genus religion. They imagined Judaism as the very embodiment of the genus itself. Now, the ways in which Jewish authors of catechisms did this changed over the course of the 19th century. So let's go back to our old friend Isaac Leeser. Isaac Leeser was the author of the first Jewish catechism written in the US. It was published in 1839, and he wrote it for Rebecca Gratz to be used in her school. It was dedicated to her. In his catechism, he defined religion in very overtly theological terms that really emphasize the centrality of the divine. So Leeser's catechism defined religion like this. Religion, he said, is the knowledge we have of God and the duties we owe in obedience to his will. To believe in God, he says, is to believe that everything I see around me, the trees, the flowers, the earth, the water, also the sun and the moon and the thousands of stars that shine in the night sky, were made by the great Creator. So for Leeser, Religion was all about God. A knowledge of religion was fundamentally knowledge of the divine. Okay? Now, because Lisa's catechism was the first one that was published in the US, many catechisms that were written subsequently used his text as a model, and so we see his definition of religion getting replicated quite a lot. So here's a catechism that was written in Michigan. It was written by Rabbi Elias Epstein, and he called his catechism the Confirmant's Guide to the Mosaic Religion, and he published it in 1868. Now, to his opening question, the question, what is religion? We see a lot of echoes of Lisa's definition. So Epstein says, religion is the knowledge of God and the mode of worshipping him. Religion teaches the knowledge of God and his attributes, he says, explaining, we experience religion when we recognized God as our omnipotent creator and Lord. As time went on, however, authors began to depart from this paradigm set by Lisa of defining religion in terms that center the divine. And they began emphasizing other definitions of religion that were more ideologically charged. So this is Isaac Mayer Wise. He's de facto the founder of the Reform movement in American Judaism. And he published a catechism in 1872. It was called Judaism, Its Doctrines and Duties. And in that catechism, he describes Judaism as the epitome of the genus religion, based on Judaism's inherent rationality. So he says, there is a religion without mysteries or miracles, rational and self-evident. It is in perfect harmony with modern criticism and science. This religion is Judaism. Therefore, it is the future religion of all mankind. And what Isaac Mayer Wise is doing here is very explicitly a critique of Christianity, because according to Wise, Christianity was based on the sort of willing suspension of disbelief in a miracle, on the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so for Wise, the claim of Judaism to be the epitome of the genus religion was that Judaism made no claim to such miracles. In his view, it could be considered as a fully rational tradition. We see very, very similar sentiments in other Reform catechisms that followed Wise's and used his as a model. So here is one written in Charleston, South Carolina. It was written in 1896 by another Reform rabbi. His name was Barnett Elzas. And in his catechism, Elzas says, Judaism is the religion that has the least amount of error intermixed with it. Judaism, he says, has nothing in it that demands credulity or blind faith. It has scarcely anything in it that may be called dogma. It is simple, exalted, and well fitted for acceptance by all mankind. Yet this he clarifies with the addenda that if we believed that any religion were better or purer than ours, we should, as reasonable beings, become followers of it. Now, these two catechisms, both written by Reform rabbis, incorporated a theology of Judaism that Reformers refer to as Judaism's prophetic mission. And this was a theory that emphasized that the rationale for maintaining Judaism in the context of modernity and in the context of assimilation was that Judaism had something to teach the world. Namely, that the Jewish idea of religion was so pure and so spiritual and so rational that it was inherently superior to all others. And so for these authors of catechisms, this was the first lesson that a Jewish Sunday school student should learn. Now, prophetic mission is pretty well known in the history of Reform Judaism. But what catechisms show us, however, is that toward the end of the 19th century, some Reform rabbis began to temper these convictions because they became so influenced by scholarship that showed that all religions had to some extent some degree of truth. That was this comparative religion scholarship. And it seemed to show them that all religions were species of the genus religion. So these authors defined religion in terms that emphasized the human experience of religion. And this human-centered understanding encouraged them to pay more attention to religions beyond the borders of Judaism. So this is Kaufman Kohler. He really sort of takes over the Reform movement after Isaac Mayer Wise's death and becomes the head of its rabbinical seminary, the Hebrew Union College. And Koller was really interested, really interested in the idea of religion as a transcultural, transhistorical human phenomenon. So as soon as he became the head of the Reform Movement Seminary, the Hebrew Union College, in 1903, one of the first things that he does is he institutes the comparative study of religion for people who are training to be rabbis. And in 1923, he authors a book analyzing the evolution of conceptions of heaven and hell in comparative religious traditions. So he was really invested in the development of this scholarship. In an 1888 sermon, he said, let religion be presented in its true fascinating garb, not as the religion of a sect or a church, to be at war with others or the target of an infidel, but as the great ideal power of life. Now, Koller authored a catechism in 1898. It was called Guide for Instruction in Judaism. And to the question, what is religion, he answers it like this. He says, the ultimate source of religion is the human impulse towards spirituality. The true source of all religion, he says in his catechism, is the human heart. All the patriarchs and prophets of old, like all the good men among the heathen, derived their religion from this source. So religion, Koller says, is innate to the experience of being human. He says in his catechism, men of all times felt the need of religion. They craved to know that God was near. So the operative understanding of religion in Koller's catechism is quite different from the other examples that we've seen thus far, right? Because he describes the experience of religion as a universal spiritual quest. He says that religion is the experience of fearing or longing to know God. And it's this universal impulse towards this that makes religion universal. Yet, while Koller did want to articulate the universal dimensions of religion and spirituality, his catechism still remained firmly attached to the idea that Judaism was the ultimate embodiment of the genus religion and of Judaism's prophetic mission. So in his catechism, he explains to his young students, God sent prophets or inspired teachers of morality to other people beside Israel, such as Balaam in the time of Moses, or Buddha in India, Confucius in China, Zoroaster in Persia, Socrates in Greece, and the like. Yet it was only to Israel, he clarified, that prophets were given to reveal God in man, and thus to establish the true religion of humanity. So he concludes in his catechism that the Jewish religion, as far as it contains the essential truths and laws of morality, is intended to be the religion of the whole human family. There's a triumphalism to these assertions, right? This sort of confident belief that Judaism is destined to be the universal religion of all mankind. That's honestly pretty unusual in a Jewish setting. Because as a non-proselytizing religion, Judaism has historically had relatively little to say about the relative merits of other religious traditions. But the use of catechisms as an educational technology, especially with that distinctive opening question, what is religion, inspired Jewish educators not only to imagine Judaism in these universal religious terms, but even to place Judaism at the apex, right, of this cultural hierarchy. And that's because Jewish authors of catechisms wanted to define religion in a way that would provide children with a rationale for maintaining their Jewish commitments in a very assimilated world. Perhaps it's unsurprising that in the context of a primer that was written for Sunday schools to protect Jewish children from Christian missionizing, authors of catechisms would choose to define Judaism as inherently more theologically rich or more rational or simply superior, right, to its Christian counterparts. And in so doing, they inverted the hierarchies proposed by most of the scholars that today we consider the founders of religious studies in a field, and who imagined Christianity as the ultimate embodiment of the phenomenon of religion. So Jewish authors of catechisms, they named Judaism as the genus religion, with all the other traditions becoming simply derivative species. I think catechisms, therefore, provide us with a really intriguing set of sources to think through the ways that American Jews engaged with liberal religious discourse during the 19th century. And we know that many American Jews who engaged in 19th century liberal religious movements, they regarded denominational boundary markers as porous rather than fixed. So 19th century American Jews went to church if there was an interesting speaker or if there was a compelling spiritual experience to be had. And they dabbled with new religious movements. They engaged with various forms of spiritual experimentation. And they did all this without necessarily departing from self-identification as Jewish, right? And all this points to the ways that American Jews saw the idea of religion as a fluid category that didn't have to be delineated by denominational boundaries. But catechisms, on the other hand, show us that while rabbis and educators did acknowledge the fluidity, right, of American liberal religion, and while they could admit that religion was universal in human life, that it was different only by the cultures and contexts in which it was practiced, nevertheless, at the same time, they also wanted to contain the free expression of religion within a hierarchy that ultimately was designed to compel Jewish loyalty. So they wanted children to know that yes, Judaism was a religion, just like the others, but only Judaism was religion in its true essence. So catechisms show us that American Jews, who after all were a very, very small religious minority group, saw contemporary religious liberal discourse about the genus religion as something that was malleable and something that they could alter and adapt to fit particular Jewish educational needs. Catechisms also show us, and this is a theme that I discuss in quite a bit of detail in the book, that American Jews engaged in thinking about religion in ways that were racialized. So when American Jews imagined religion in these hierarchical terms, hierarchies that they imagined themselves at the head of, they also imagined the inverse of the spectrum. So 19th century American Jews, like 19th century American Christians, imagined religion in terms that were teleological, in terms that imagined a linear hierarchy of progress, from the most heathen religions to the most spiritually sophisticated. American Jewish authors of catechisms utilize these racialized schemas of comparative religion to make a set of claims about where they thought that Judaism fit into the modern world. These schemas offered these Jews a map that they could use to show that Judaism was not in the domain of the heathen, the uncultured, but rather that it was at the pinnacle of human cultural achievement. So these schemas allowed American Jews to map Judaism onto whiteness, because of course in every 19th century hierarchy of cultural progress, whiteness was always placed at the top. And these schemas also enabled American Jews to imagine Judaism as a universal rather than as an ethnic or particular religion. Because in the maps of world religion that were created by white Protestants, to have ethnic religion meant to be partial and incomplete and confined to one part of the world. Jewish authors of catechisms transformed these ethnic identifications into a superior brand of rational spirituality. So quite simply, Jewish authors of catechisms utilize these inverted hierarchies of racialized world religion in order to write Judaism into the future. Textbooks written for children aren't often taken seriously as sources of modern Jewish thought. So in my book, I unearth the stories of the teachers and the students who attended 19th century Jewish Sunday schools in order to place their experience in the much broader context of Jewish attempts to understand Judaism as a religion. Because arguably, this question was the central question that in modernity Jews were trying to resolve. Educational sources show us at a grassroots level that American Jews were wrestling with how Judaism could be transposed into the Protestant-inflected idiom of religion during a time of enormous diversity in public conversations about what religion was and how it could be defined. So in this talk, I've focused mostly on one set of sources, the questions and answers of 19th century catechisms. But in my book, I also trace how these ideas surfaced and were debated in other kinds of sources as well. For example, I look at the gendered ways in which religion was imagined in the context of Jewish education. I examine the material cultures of children's periodicals and other educational aids that were created to be used in classrooms. I look at new rituals that were created to celebrate Jewish coming of age. And I also explore theories about the nature of childhood that Jews incorporated from the emerging field of developmental psychology. What's running across all of these chapters, and indeed I think is really at the heart of the book, is the argument that we should take educational sources seriously as sources for understanding religious life, both past and present. I think educational sources are really easy to dismiss as pediatric, right, or useful only for scholars of learning who want to improve contemporary religious pedagogy. Instead, I argue that education is where the grassroots effort of religious meaning-making gets done. It's where the complexities of theology and philosophy have to be rendered in their most intelligible terms. So to adapt religious studies scholar Anne Broad's famous dictum, the history of American Jewish education is the history of American Judaism. And it's also the history of American Jewish religion. Fast forward to today, and supplemental Jewish schools still remain the regnant form of Jewish educational institution that are attended by Orthodox American Jews today. This preference for the so-called Protestant model, in which religious schooling is undertaken on a supplementary basis rather than in full-day schools, this has long been judged to characterize the commitments of American Jews to participation in mainstream American life through the patronage of the public school system. Historically, it's also underscored the idea that Judaism in modernity should be primarily positioned as a set of leisure time faith commitments. This model for Jewish education was created in the 19th century. It was created in the context of an unprecedented set of new public educational opportunities for American Jewish youth. And it was created in order to show American Jews that Judaism was a religion. The curricula of 19th century American Jewish Sunday schools not only foregrounded that Judaism was one of many religions in the world, but even that it was the most superior incarnation of the very idea of religion itself. There's a referendum at large among American Jews today, and it's a referendum about whether this explicitly religious curriculum really still has meaning for contemporary American Jews. And that's because American Jews today increasingly are beginning to self-identify as Jews of no religion. And that means that they see their commitments to Judaism not in religious terms, but primarily in communal or ethnic or familial identifications. I think if the historical case of 19th century American Jewish Sunday schools has anything to offer this ongoing referendum, I think it's that American Jews have never accepted the idea of religion as a stable and fixed concept. 19th century American Jewish educators did not just define Jewish education as religious education. They defined and redefined religion over and over again in their catechisms. And in turn, they made and remade their Jewish educational curricula in response to a changing landscape of ideas about what religion was and how far its parameters could stretch. So I think the story of American Jewish Sunday schools shows us that American Jews have historically had the chutzpah to wrestle with the idea of what religion is, rather than to simply blindly accept it or summarily reject it. And what could be more distinctively Jewish than that? Thank you very much. Happy to take questions. It's also very warm. Should we open the door as I think the draft has gone? Okay. I'm happy to take questions, but if everybody is warm and falling asleep, it's also okay not to have any questions. Yeah. John.
If you could grab onto this microphone, speak into it.
Yeah, thank you for this wonderful presentation. The question I had was based on some of the things that you were citing there. Who were the heathens? Who did they have in mind as heathens? Like, where did that expand to? And like, was that translating a particular Hebrew word, or like,
Yeah.
how does this category work in a Jewish context?
In a Jewish context. So primarily when they're using that term, they are referring to the population of people that Abraham, right, sort of knew and was born into. So it is a historical category. Would they have applied it to contemporary groups? I think that is a safe bet too.
Thank you for a really interesting talk. I was interested to ask you about some of the claims that Judaism was a universal religion, and as you point out, it's usually not a proselytizing religion, so that kind of stood out as something that maybe is out of the norm that you're used to thinking about or hearing about. And I wanted you to expand on some of the motives for it and implications of it. Did it kind of seep into any kind of openness to proselytization, or was it, did it only have implications for kind of academic argumentation kind of within the society? I just kind of thought that was unusual.
It's very unusual. It's not something that you would hear much of today. So in part, this is a distinctively Reform reinterpretation of what traditionally has been understood to be connoted by the Messianic age, right? So traditionally, Jews have a belief of the Messiah, right, who is yet to come. Who will, restore, Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel, and this will be a time of fulfilled prophecy, and et cetera, et cetera. The Reform movement rejected that claim. They rejected that claim, and they did that for a number of reasons. Primarily, though, to show their loyalty to the nation states that they wanted Jews to be considered full citizens of, right? So by rejecting the Jewish claim, sort of hopes for the Messiah, they want to say no. Like, we are not hoping for a future age in which Jews will live in the land of Israel, right, and reign supreme. But in fact, our home and our vision for Jewish life is right here. And one of the ways you see this very, very distinctively is in the Reform preference for referring to synagogues as temples, right? With the idea being, we're not hoping for the reestablishment of the temple in Jerusalem. Our temple is here and now. So that's one of the things that is happening with his prophetic mission, right? It's a reinterpretation of the traditional idea of the Messianic age, which says, we are hoping for an age of universal harmony and peace, not in this sort of territorial, sort of military idea of a return to the land of Israel, but in this more sort of philosophical, vision of a time of universal peace, and in which the original idea of monotheism, right, which of course, according to those theologians, belonged to the Jews, right, and was later developed on by other religions, that would be the future religion of all mankind. As Jews in the later 19th century and then into the 20th century, in the Reform movement begin to re-embrace some of the things that they had previously discarded, the prophetic mission idea sort of tends to recede into the background. But I think if you sort of look at different conceptions of the sort of revised conceptions of the Messianic age, you can still sort of see it underneath the surface. But it never extended into proselytism. David.
Yeah, thank you. This was a really engaging talk, Laura. And I just had a question about sort of the different strains or the different modes of Sunday Sunday school. Did the sort of new, more male-centered catechistic training completely supplant that first tradition of the sort of dame schools, feminine, very pragmatic Sunday schools? I sort of missed, the transition from one to the other, whether it completely supplanted. And I was also interested in looking ahead a little bit into the 20th century. Did the catechism model sort of continue? How far into the 20th century did that extend?
Yeah. So the first Jewish Sunday schools were created by women. The first, met only on Sunday mornings. Later schools maybe met once, either just on Sunday mornings or maybe once during the week as well. And as they became more popular, they got really incorporated into congregations. So Rebecca Gratz's school was an independent school, but as this became the most popular mode of American Jewish education, they got sort of incorporated into the mainstream. And in the context of congregations, women were still serving as the volunteer teachers in the classroom, but the curriculum was really being set by men. It was being set by the rabbis and by male education boards. And the involvement that a rabbi would typically have in the sort of educational business of the school was teaching the confirmation class. That was the class of the oldest students who were preparing for confirmation. And those classes tended to happen through catechism. So catechisms were always part of the sort of Sunday school program of curriculum and instruction. There were also catechisms for younger children that looked a little bit different. There was always teaching by catechism, which I think really kind of pushes against this idea that these schools only taught sort of vapid saccharine spirituality, because whilst you had some aspects of the curriculum that definitely seemed to sort of move Judaism right towards the sort of Protestant sort of bourgeois model, at the same time you had these classes in which children were expected to be sort of drilled in religious instruction. Isaac Lisa in the first catechism, he writes the first catechism, authored by an American Jew. He says, children are empty vessels, and you just need to kind of fill them up with knowledge. And even if they don't understand what they're learning, they'll get older, and then all of that information they've got stored, they'll remember. So catechisms start to get increasingly critiqued towards the end of the 19th century and into the 20th, and not just in a Jewish context, right? Primers for rote memorization are used heavily in public education and in Christian schools. And as progressive education starts to kind of build steam in, US education more broadly, that's one of the things that really comes under attack, is this idea of children as empty vessels that need to be filled up with knowledge. And so primers and catechisms start to decline in public education settings, and Jewish educators follow suit. As Jews are influenced by sort of progressive ideas of education, they start to say, well, no, right? Children are not empty vessels, right? There is more to the anthropology of the child than this. And in fact, the sixth chapter of my book sort of deals with this move towards sort of progressive philosophies of education. But one of the things that I like to point out, especially when I'm talking about this book to interviewers who are Jewish and to Jewish audiences, is that there's still a lot of rote memorization that happens in Jewish education today. Has anybody in the room maybe had a bar or bat mitzvah at some point in their lives? Yep, a couple people, or maybe been to a bar or bat mitzvah, or maybe a friend has had a bar or bat mitzvah. So if you, most kids, I think, who have had a bar or bat or b mitzvah have done something which involves a number of things. They have led portions of the Saturday morning services, they've given a speech, and they have chanted from the Torah. I do not think that it is an outlandish claim to say that the vast majority of children who chant from the Torah have got absolutely no idea what they are actually reciting. But they have spent a lot of time memorizing. They've memorized the Hebrew words, they've memorized the trope, which is the musical cantillation of how the Torah is read. And often they have done so by having a recording, an audio recording of their portion that they have listened to over and over again. So I think it's easy to look back at catechisms and say, well, gosh, how antiquated. This idea of children, empty vessels, fill them up with knowledge. There's still lots of examples of rote memorization in not just American Jewish education today, but of course in general education as well, as any of you will know if you've ever had to study for a quiz, right?
So this might have been answered, but I had a question about just the word catechism itself, because I had previously only ever heard it through the Catholic Christian lens of someone saying, oh, I have to go to catechism. I've always heard it as a sort of a synonym for Sunday school.
Yeah.
So does it refer to written documents or spoken, or because I know I know it's words, but
yeah. So let me see what's the best. So if you see the images here on the left, they're little pamphlets.
Okay.
So it's like, imagine it kind of looks like that. And I think one of the reasons, honestly, why we have so many of them that have actually survived, because the challenge of writing a book on 19th century Sunday schools is that most things don't make it, right? They don't remain in the archives, and archives are very, they're politicized institutions, they're gendered institutions, and people preserve things that they think are intellectually important and weighty, and often materials created for children don't make the cut. But I think one of the reasons why catechisms made the cut is that because they were so cheap, and they got advertised in the American Jewish press in bulk, because there were these little pamphlets, so you'd see advertisements in the American Jewish press say, buy 20, get 2 free, that kind of a thing. Because there were so many of them, they survived, and children were given individual ones that they could take home. So they were little kind of pamphlets in sort of question answer, and they were very, very cheap to produce and purchase. And I think that's another reason why they became so popular, right? Because they were affordable. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the really, really fascinating talk. So I wanted to ask a question about the picture that was resting.
The pageant?
Yeah, the pageant. Just because this is beautiful, gorgeous picture. But I'm wondering, how does it connect? To what extent? And you may not know, right? This may be the materials that didn't last, right? But to what extent? I mean, this looks more like sort of our imagination or our vision of what our kids are doing in Hebrew school now, right? It's beautiful and fun, and right, and presumably it's a holiday, right? Purim. It's maybe maybe I don't know. It doesn't say, but do you have any sense of sort of how the catechisms fit in with maybe other activities that went on during Sunday school? To what extent are they doing other kinds of things that are maybe more and this is maybe during the progressive era that you were talking about, right? So maybe there's more kind of anthropological attention to children's experiences and learning. But this is such a beautiful picture. I'd love to hear more about how it fits in.
It's so nice, and it's from it's from Oregon, which this book really has a national scope. And I think often we think of 19th century to the 20th century, we think New York, and so it was really important to me that the sort of images and as much of the material culture that I was able to talk about was national. So pageants were great. Pageants were fundraisers. They were fundraisers, and even there was one in San Francisco around this time, same year, 1898, that was held at Golden Gate Hall, for example. And so these were, the children would put on shows, particularly around the holidays. They would do spelling tournaments, and it was all to sort of create community entertainment. We got to cast our minds back. This was a long time before Netflix, right? People had a different idea of what made for a good night out. Not to say that there's anything wrong with going to a spelling tournament now, if that is your thing. But lots of spelling tournaments, lots of pageants, and there were fundraisers. There were fundraisers for the schools, as well as sort of celebrations for the children, and sort of engaging things for them to do. Another reason why catechisms were so popular is that they provided a script for confirmation, right? So this is chapter 3 of the book is all about confirmation, and confirmation were these really, really grand spectacles, really, these rituals held on Shavuot, which is a Jewish holiday held in the sort of late spring, early summer that traditionally commemorates the revelation of the Torah. And the thing about catechisms, right, that really made them kind of hang on into the 20th century was that there was something that was very, very impressive about these children who had learnt catechism in their confirmation class, parading to the front of the sanctuary. And when the rabbi said, "Lo, what is religion?" they could sort of parrot back this, very polished answer in adult prose. That seemed, right, and confirmation became so popular that you would get reviews in the American Jewish press that reviewed them almost as theatre productions, right, talking about the music and the lighting and the staging and the decoration, that kind of thing, and how impressively the children recited their catechisms. in schools where clearly they didn't have the financial means to purchase a catechism for every child, one of the things that the rabbi who taught the confirmation class would do is he would read the catechism out loud, and the children would write down, right? So they would copy it out verbatim. And it is very clear that these children had very little idea or understanding of so much of what they were memorizing, because you see these really endearing spelling mistakes. Really endearing spelling mistakes. So catechisms had a very kind of performative second life in the context of confirmation. But in terms of younger grades, there would certainly be a lot of Bible reading and other kinds of and Bible history was a really popular subject. The imagination that the Bible was a historical record, right, that children could learn. And periodicals also became very, very popular very, very quickly as a resource that were used in classrooms. And so various national organizations and publishers produced children's periodicals that American Jewish children used in schools. And these periodicals would have, stories and games and puzzles and things like that, that if you read them now, they feel very, very kind of heavy and didactic, but certainly a little bit less so than memorizing a catechism. Good question. Yeah, me.
I grabbed the microphone, so it's my turn. Thank you for this talk. It's great to hear more about your research. And the thing that struck me from the very beginning is the radical nature of what Rebecca Gratz was doing. And so I wanted to kind of push on a couple things and hear more about, first of all, there's the gender and the class, right? That this was going to be open to everybody, no matter if you could pay or not, and whether you were male or female. But the thing that really struck me is that she is coming from an Orthodox background. Mm-hmm. And so I'm imagining these schools with, co-ed, mm-hmm. and the types of education that had previously been available to men and women Jewishly was very different. And I'm imagining, who were the Orthodox fathers families who sent their boys to these places, mm-hmm. Where they were clearly not learning Talmud Torah, right? Yeah. Because that wasn't what they could offer. So I'm kind of curious about that, and then curious about when it developed that the male rabbis started to have more of a say, and whether kind of what impact that had on the schools and the people that went to the schools, and how much that changed. And also, I'm thinking about just the dailiness of Judaism, right? That it is a civilization, right? And there's laws that govern every aspect. And so what of that was being taught in these Orthodox versus Reform schools, which seems that they would offer very different things.
Yeah. Well, I think, just as now there was a sort of realistic assessment of what you could do with a school that met only for a couple of hours on a Sunday morning. So you see parents sending them with the full recognition that so much of the child's Jewish education would happen at home and in other settings as well. But there were advantages to sending a child to go to these schools on Sunday mornings. We do have, I've seen a couple of examples of memoirs where students who came from Orthodox families said that their parents decided to send them to the Sunday schools because in the Talmud Torahs and the Cheders, which were elementary Orthodox educational institutions, the teachers used to beat the children, and their parents didn't want them to go there. So often the choice to send the child to the Sunday school, to the local Sunday school, wasn't ideologically motivated. It was motivated by ease, by convenience, by accessibility, and just as now, by the child's sense that was a place that was preferable to be. I'm trying to kind of think back to your other questions. Men took over within a generation of the first Sunday schools, and you see that quite directly in terms of the sort of, there's a real kind of heavy-handed policing of what volunteer teachers could teach. So, for example, there's a memoir by a woman who ends up becoming very, very famous as a sort of social activist. Her name is Rebecca Kohut, and as a child, as a young girl, she taught Sunday school in San Francisco, at Ohebe Shalom in San Francisco, where her father was the rabbi. And she decided, this was a girl who was Orthodox. She had a robust Jewish education of her own, and she decided one day that instead of teaching, she was supposed to teach an elementary catechism, so a catechism for young kids, and they were going to memorize it. She would read it out, and they would parrot back the response. She wanted to teach about inspirational characters from the Bible. And one day, apparently, she was teaching about the story of Ruth, and the chairman of the school board came around, dropped into her classroom, saw that she was doing this, and she wasn't teaching what they had mandated as the board, and she was immediately kicked out from her position, and her father was apparently given a very, very stern reprimand as the rabbi for not more carefully supervising, right, and letting her do something so rogue as to teach the story of Ruth in a Sunday school context. So, yeah, I think does that answer all your questions? All right. It is warm and late. I think we should let these students go home. Thank you all, everybody.